From the beginning, Thomas Jefferson was a strong proponent of expansion of the United States. In 1803, Jefferson helped to engineer the purchase of Louisiana Territory from France. Now, this nearly doubled the size of the United States with the addition of 828,000 square miles to the budding nation. Although he was wary of overstepping his executive powers, Jefferson boldly led the United States into a new age of expansion and movement. Since childhood, he had always been interested in westward lands since his father, Peter, was a surveyor, mapmaker, and land speculator on the Virginia frontier. Jefferson believed that the United States should continue to move westward as it grew. He most clearly expressed this idea in his 1809 letter to James Madison, in which he stated that the United States should expand with the eventual goal of becoming a, quote, empire for liberty. Now, this idea of the empire for liberty is something that appears throughout American history under another name, Manifest Destiny.
Here, in the 1872 painting by John Gast called Manifest Destiny, Lady Liberty is shown moving west along with the settlers and frontiersmen, carrying on the legacy of Thomas Jefferson by creating the empire for liberty that he had once envisioned.
Gordon Wood, a history professor at Brown University, later expanded upon Jefferson's ideas in the book Empire of Liberty. Through Thomas Jefferson's strong leadership abilities, he ignited a desire for expansion within the United States with the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, in turn shaping the makeup of the region in terms of slavery and the nation's interactions with Native Americans.
Upon the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson began taking steps to explore the new frontier. In 1803, Jefferson sent a letter to Meriwether Lewis telling him, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it, as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean." In other words, their object was to find a water passage across the North American continent. During their famous expedition, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark navigated along the northern parts of the Louisiana Territory and made contact with different Native American tribes and developed mostly positive relations with them. Zebulon Pike, another explorer commissioned by Jefferson, was sent in 1805 to catalog southern and western parts of the Louisiana Territory. During his travels, he famously said that the Great Plains of the West were the Great American Desert, which would later become home to the many Native Americans forced out of their lands. During his travels, he came across one mountain, which was famously named Pike's Peak in his honor.
Because Missouri's wish to become a state would upset the balance in the Union between free and strict slave states, the Missouri Compromise was created in order to maintain balance, and as a result help slavery expand. As the newly bought land west of the Mississippi opened up, following the exploration and surveying of Louisiana Territory, an increasingly larger number of people moved westward toward open land. Between 1810 and 1820, the population of the territory grew from roughly 20,000 to 67,000, according to the U.S. Census, achieving the required 60,000 people to apply for statehood. As people moved west, many slave owners moved into the Missouri Territory, so when Missouri applied for statehood in 1817, they applied as a slave state. As a result, Henry Clay engineered the Missouri Compromise in order to restrict slavery out west below the 3630 line. The Missouri Compromise line served as a barrier to slavery and prevented both slaves and slaveholders from migrating to the northern territories, and instead encouraged them to move west. In his Firebell in the Night letter to John Holmes, Thomas Jefferson considered the compromise to be the knell of the Union, the physical manifestation of an irreconcilable divide in the Union. Also, with the end of the international slave trade, slaves no longer entered the country from foreign lands, and instead reproduced from existing slaves, creating a unique environment for slavery in the United States. This ban on importation of slaves led to more slave trading within the U.S., especially to the western frontier.
Following the exploration of new land in the West by Lewis and Clark, Native American relations were established and large amounts of territory were made available, which later allowed for the forced relocation of Native Americans by the American people. During that time period, the American population was expanding faster than ever. As American civilization grew, it needed room to expand. This led to people pushing Native Americans out of their lands in order to claim them for themselves. In Thomas Jefferson's letter to John Adams, he says that, quote, "A branch of the Cherokees is now instituting a regular representative government. Some other tribes were advancing in the same line. showing that many Native Americans wished to preserve their rights to the land that the Americans were encroaching upon. Instead, this practice was eventually culminated in the Indian Removal Act, which was possible because the American people now had a place to which they could relocate the Native Americans.
The presence of Indians east of the Mississippi River created an awkward situation for the United States, and it slowly led to forced movement of the American Indians westward in reaction to the movement of Americans. Even Thomas Jefferson realized that the close proximity of Indians to the frontiersmen and ever-moving lines of cities was a threat to Americans. He said, quote, "The possession of that country secures our women and children forever from the tomahawk and scalping knife. Therefore, Indian removal to a tolerable distance seemed unavoidable."
In the midst of Indian removal, Jefferson emphasized that the Native Americans should not be treated like outsiders, much like the arguments of many abolitionists during the Reform period. However, Indians were nevertheless treated as such, for the mentality of the time was that the Native Americans were a lesser race, similar to, although still better than, blacks. This is evidenced by the way that when relocation began, the Native Americans asked to be included in deliberations concerning their land. They were, however, ignored, and their lands were dealt with as the Americans pleased.
Although Thomas Jefferson believed that purchasing the Louisiana Territory extended beyond his presidential powers, he realized that the magnitude of effect this purchase would have on the nation. By seizing the amazing deal that Napoleon offered for the Louisiana Territory, even though Jefferson wondered if he had the constitutional power to do so, he took the United States down a road of expansion towards a dream of an empire for liberty. Going against his own principles about the Constitution and the nature of power of the central government, Jefferson acted for the current and future good of the nation. As a result, he doubled the land of the United States and shattered the looming fear that foreign nations would take control of the area and stifle the growth of the new nation.
Although this expansion had enormous amounts of positive effects for citizens of the United States, it did negatively affect other peoples, including the Native Americans. One such example of this is the Trail of Tears, which was forced removal of Native American tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Before this, tensions between those on the frontier and Native Americans had grown steadily worse as the unending line of United States citizens continued westward. This tension culminated in uprisings such as the Northwest Indian War and the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1795. Slavery also drove a wedge into the nation along northern and southern lines. Thomas Jefferson said that the division between the two sides over the issue, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper.
Not only did Jefferson's legacy have short-term effects, but it also had long-term effects, which can be seen through many things. One such thing is Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, spoken at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. This thesis expresses themes of a new beginning for Americans, one where they can shape their own destiny, and he states that the history of America is essentially a history of westward expansion. Turner's most important takeaway from his piece is that the most influential effect of Frontier is the development of democracy.
Other, more contemporary effects of this surge of westward expansion are expressed in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. This novel depicts a family who moves out west to California in hopes of a new life. Steinbeck's themes are further expressed in the 1995 Bruce Springsteen song, The Ghost of Tom Joad. Such things show how Thomas Jefferson's legacy of westward expansion has influenced America even to this day. By initiating the first surge of westward expansion and inspiring Manifest Destiny, Jefferson made a lasting impression on the nation as a whole.
The highway is alive at night, but nobody's kidding nobody about where it goes. I'm sitting down here in the campfire light with a ghost of old Tom Joad.